Luka's Kids, it's Luka's Kids, it's Luka's Kids.
Well, welcome to another episode of Luka's Kits. Today we're going to cover a really special kit for me, probably the kit that I built more of. And it's not so much that it's this particular kit, which is the Mountain Dew Buick Regal driven by Darrell Waltrip in the NASCAR Grand National Series back in 81 and 82, which he won the championships in. I'm showing this particular kit because this was the first of the series that Monogram put out. This was in the succession of Monogram serial numbers. It's 2204, which the rest of them go, farther down the line. So this was the first one, technically. I believe they came out in 82, and this particular one is the 82 Mountain Dew Buick. The reason why I'm saying that this kit will kind of cover a whole bunch of kits because Monogram redid this kit over the years to depict different cars, sometimes just by throwing another set of decals into the Buick or any of the GM cars through the 80s and into the 90s. They continued to use the base model, this model kit with all these parts, this engine, this chassis. They would just change the body, either Monte Carlo, and then later on they changed it to the Aero Coupe Monte Carlo. Also the later Pontiacs and Buicks. So this kit really ran through the years, very popular. And if you've never built an 80s or early 90s NASCAR race car, this is a great kit to start with. Whether you get this Mountain Dew Buick Regal or all the other ones, you can find them at swap meets. These days, a lot of these kits, they really dropped in value. You can pick them up cheap. Let's go on and start looking at it. And there's a little shot of the side box art showing how the body can come off and exposes all the chassis so you can display it, showing all the detail. This day in the early 80s, when they did this, they really paid attention to realism and detail and accuracy. These depict the cars of that era perfect. And they not only did GM cars, they also did Fords. We're not going to cover the Ford Thunderbirds. They had their own separate chassis by two different chassis builders. And in all the GM cars, the chassis builder who they chose to replicate was Laughlin Racing, which is Mike Laughlin, who designed and built these particular chassis that were very popular in a lot of the cars that ran in the Grand National Circuit throughout the 80s. Let's take this off. Alright, and start with the body. Just an outstanding representation of the early 80s Buick Regal in its NASCAR stock car racing form. They widened the fenders, did really excellent fender flares. There was great detail in the window straps, and you kept the lines of the doors. It was just a panel, and they left it to look like it was still a door, but later on lots of times they would fill those in. You could go either way when you're building this car, but it's nice that they leave that in because a lot of them still had what you could see as the door panel. So there you go for the body. And the hood hinged very well, so you could display with the hood up and it looked very realistic. And of course we have the instructions for the kit. And again, this is the Mountain Dew Buick Regal, but all these instructions are pretty much the same in every one of these NASCAR kits that were the GM cars. They would just change the illustration of the bodies, but it'd be all the same exact instructions. And then of course they would have these pictures for decal placement. Very good instructions. And then you've got your flat plate for the chassis. Excellent detail of the floor that they used to use. Back in the day, NASCAR rules depicted, even into the 80s, that they had to have a stock factory floor pan, but it never said what one. And what was the most common one used by all the chassis builders was the stamped floor panels from the 66 Ford Galaxy. And they depict the 66 Ford Galaxy floor very well on this. And of course they would be modified for clearance of different chassis components, and they would run the Chevrolet trailing arms in the rear suspension, which they depicted really well in all your roll cage pieces. And it's just an excellent detailed chassis. It has everything. You have your screw jacks right there and there. You have your fabricated tin work of the rear tubs and the rear half of the whole car with the bead roll that you have in there, and the box for the fuel cell. Just a really nice work they did there. Here's the rest of the roll cage, and it goes together so easy. This one's a little broken, but that's easy to repair. You have excellent detail on all of the tubing that's used, and it goes together so easy. Like I said, these are some of the easiest to put together models that Monogram put out, and they just look so good. It's really a excellent kit. If you want to build a stock car, you're going to enjoy it, and you're going to get a lot of detail in your model. And here is a tree full of stuff. The front suspension, and Mike Laughlin was one that engineered his front suspension to utilize Chevy type lower control arms. But if anybody is familiar with chassis, these control arms were actually flipped. In other words, in his chassis, he took the left side lower control arm from the Chevy and put it on the right side, and vice versa, right to left. It's just how he set it up for different angles that were much more aggressive for racing and handling. We have excellent rear springs here, the Monroe shocks, and in those days they ran the dual shocks at each corner, the cross member with the upper control arms, and then there's this silly little a weird setup of the headers. These were headers that when they went to go look at a particular car to get all the specs to do these models, it had this experimental header system that there were cross under pipes. They ended up not really using them much in the series, so a lot of guys, they would build these and they'd cut those off and file them. But I also found any of the Monogram 24 scale 57 Chevys, if you can ever get a hold of one of those, they've got the perfect Chevy small block headers that fit excellent in these kits, and I've used those a ton of times in my builds. Or you can just whack these off or just build it. The problem is when you put these together, you've got this seam to fill because they're in halves. If you can see how it's two halves. There's the upper tubular control arms. Once you trim this center plastic out of there, they look really excellent. Excellent detail on the dashboard. Your Ford 9-inch rear end that all the cars used. Your typical stock car steering wheel. Everything. It even came with, back in the day, was really popular. They made a big deal in the early 80s. When CBS was airing the Daytona 500, they had these remote controlled cameras in the cars that were just state of the art, and they could get some amazing shots that never had been seen before in any type of racing. We get into the rest of the chassis. The fuel cell, a lot of detail. There you've got the firewall with your brake and clutch master cylinders and the radiator overflow tank. The rest of your dashboard up in here. The seats that they used in the earlier days before they went to the more body hugging support seats, but and the back is right there. They used these old seats that were best known for being in old Dodge A100 vans, and then they would add this bolstering right here so the driver doesn't go flying out. And this was kind of floating around in there. This was the exhaust. Comes off of those headers. Side exiting pipes. Here's an interesting part that's off the tree that you find in these kits. And a lot of people don't know what it is. It's not in the instructions at all. But it's just this little cylinder, and lots of times it falls off the tree and it's laying in the bottom of the box, and nobody knows what the heck it is. What it is it's the antenna for that remote camera, to operate the remote camera and for it to send off its transmissions. And what they would do is, in order for the whole system to work, they would have to have a helicopter over the racetrack the whole time in order to receive the transmissions from the cars and then send it back down to the control booth. And that was what was on the cars, lots of times mounted on the deck lid of the cars. If you watch any of the old races on YouTube, you might see these cylinders sticking out of the back of the car, and that's what they are for. So if you do decide to mount that camera in the car, you want to put that on there too. Now on to the great chrome tree. They just did an outstanding job with the chrome tree. You have your bumpers, of course, and all your And let's flip that around so you can see the Buick grill with all the detail of the screen that they would put over the grills, the riveted covers that went over the blinker holes on the bumper, very nice wheels, your radiator, your oil cooler, excellent valve covers, and I really always loved how they did these rear spoilers to make them look like thin sheet metal when you'd mount it onto the body. They did an outstanding job because they kind of pie shaped them where they would be like a razor blade at the end, so it would just give the illusion of a very thin piece of metal. The unfortunate thing, what I always thought was a bummer, is they had these little nibs or whatever on them, and you'd have to cut those off and it would ruin the chrome. But with the new Molotow, yeah, we're not going to get into that again. With that, you could probably fix those up. And then lots of times you want to shoot some dull coat over them to make them look more like aluminum. Of course, you got your headlight buckets with the covers and screen right there for the cooling ducts to go to the oil cooler, hood pins and deck lid pins, a Hurst shifter, oil pan with the dry sump right there, and your intake manifold. An okay rendition of an intake manifold. It has a molded on distributor, but you know, you can make that look real good. You drill into the distributor and run spark plug wires if you want to do a detailed model. Now next I want to get onto the decals, but I'll tell you, you know, you can get anything you want. Either kit decals came, and nowadays there's so many great companies that make aftermarket decals, but the kit decals, I don't have a set of the actual original decals that came in this particular kit. What I do have is they did reissue this kit, and I can show you the decals that came in that kit, which are pretty good. But I'll tell you right now, they fixed these decals because the original ones were missing something that were really tough to deal with when you didn't have a lot of other sources to go for decals when you build that model. This red pinstripe right above the green that went along the side, they omitted that. It wasn't in the original decals. The decals looked exactly like this, but did not have that red stripe. They had the red stripes that went around and around the roof and everything, but they didn't have that. I built the kit once, and I literally got a bunch of these decals that I started rating the red stripe from other decal sheets. That kit is no longer on display. It's in my junkyard, but I happen to have the body of when I built this thing, probably in the mid or late 80s. But all you had was these red pinstripes that were on the top. And the green was really not quite correct. And I never liked how they had in the decal sheet the little block out for the door handle. It was just printed on there. They did it again in the updated sheets. But you know what you do with this sheet? You throw it away. Because there's great companies like this was Wetworks, and they do an outstanding decal sheet to replace the incorrect kit sheets. And you've got all the proper red pinstriping. It's the right size. You don't have that goofy plate. You know, they didn't print that on there. And what I also like about this decal sheet is, one, they got the green a little better. And there's some people say that it was a dark green, and some say that it was a metallic green. And I have never seen the cars in person to know. I tend to lean towards it was this dark green. You know, they could have changed it from a different race from here to there. A super speedway car at Daytona might have had the metal flake. And then in the short track cars, they just had, you know, green. But it's also very cool that you don't have any fender decals. You end up putting the fender decals on. Or you can leave it like pre-race where you don't have any decals. And there you have it. That is another kit out of my collection, which I have many versions of this one. But again, this covers a lot of kits. Any of the GM cars that ran in the 80s and the early 90s, Monogram, then switching to Revell later on, getting into the 90s, but it's all the same kit. And then they reissued some of the older ones later on in the 90s and even in the 2000s. They would every once in a while punch out these kits. So that's going to be it for this episode of Luka's Kits. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned some stuff. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below. If you have any other information on these kits, because you've been building them as long as I have or longer, and you might just have a little more knowledge, I'm always open ears. I love hearing all the historic details of modeling and model kits too. Thanks a lot for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.